Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
We've been doing Heschel the last few weeks. We're going to do more Heschel today. This is the last passage we're going to look at, and maybe we'll finish it today. Maybe we'll get through it today. Maybe it'll take 2 weeks. I can't say. Okay. Heschel has an essay, short essay, less than 2 pages, but of course everything he says is dense. And this is an essay based on the rabbinic dictum of humility in prayer, or I don't want to say humility because that advances the issue maybe in a way I shouldn't, but awareness of prayer, and that rabbinic dictum is Da lifnei mi ata omed. Wow. Am I out of order? Oh, look at that. My pages are out of order. That's interesting. Okay. My pages are out of order, but they're all here. Da lifnei mi ata omed. Know before whom you stand. Da, no, like yada, it's command form. Lifnei mi, before whom, ata omed. Or I guess Hebrew's very gendered, so we might say at omedet. Okay? Know before whom you stand. And Heschel is going to have this essay. I take it back. I said it was 2 pages. It's 3 pages on these 3. It's not really 3 words. Da, lifnei mi, ata omed. 5 words, but it's 3 ideas. Okay? So he's going to try to unpack or explain his view of each one of these 3 words. Everyone with me?
Yeah.
That's what we're doing today. I'm at the bottom of page 210, and I'm going to try to size it well so that you can see it. Okay. There's a classical statement in rabbinic literature that expresses the spiritual minimum of prayer as an act of consciousness of the human. Know before whom you stand. 3 ideas are contained in this definition. Know, K-N-O-W, know, command form, imperative. A certain understanding or awareness. A definite attitude of the mind is the condition sine qua non of all prayer. Prayer cannot live in a theological vacuum. It comes out of insight. By the way, the whole last 2.5 years from April 2023, the goal of this class on Tuesday mornings has been for us to not pray out of a theological vacuum, but rather to be looking at ideas that various Jewish thinkers have had about God so that we can formulate, probably most of us before this class had some ideas formulated, but so that we can think some more and see how various Jewish thinkers have formulated their ideas about God. Okay? So you can't pray in a vacuum. It's what he says. You have to have insight. One needs understanding. I'm only reading what I underlined. One needs understanding, wisdom of the Spirit, to know what it means to worship God. Okay? You got to have some understanding. Now he goes on really back to the first thing we read in Heschel about being connected to God and the individual becoming aware of one's connection to God, as we read in Rav Kook also, the same Hasidic idea. To live without prayer is to live without God, to live without a soul. It's a pretty strong statement, right? If you think back to the beginning of Heschel, what we read, where he basically says, being unaware of God means your soul is cut off from the world soul. And remember, Rav Kook said this even more, a little with an edge to it. He said, and it's kind of inevitable that the individual's soul will long to feel connected to the world soul, to God. For Heschel, it's a choice. For Rav Kook, it's an inevitability. It's a drive. I guess I'm going to put it that way. Heschel says, no, modern human can choose to see this or choose to know it or choose to not know it. If we choose to not know it, then we live without a soul. Rav Kook would have said, no, we all have a soul. I don't think Heschel really means that you don't have a soul. I think he means then you're living without awareness of your soul. I think that's what he means if he were here and we could question him. Rav Kook would say, your soul inexorably longs to feel connected to the world soul, to God, and to not be disconnected. Okay. Humans, the human, first is aware of God's presence long before we think of God's essence. This is actually, I think, a pretty important sentence. We're aware of God's presence before we think of God's essence. God's essence, to me, means actually under what we're trying to do in this class for the last 2.5 years, which is to try to understand what we mean or think or feel when we're talking about God. And Heschel says, before that, before one thinks of God's essence, one is aware of God's presence. And to pray is to sense God's presence. There are people who maintain that prayer is a matter of emotion. In their desire to revitalize prayer, they would proclaim, let there be emotion. Feeling, feeling, feeling. This is, of course, based on a fallacy. Emotion is an important component, but it is not the source of prayer. Worship comes out of insight. Although I thought, insight, which I think he's using here as fairly synonymous to this word here, awareness. Okay? So being aware of God's presence, having an insight into God's existence. It doesn't mean understanding God. Okay? Not the result of an intellectual oversight. I don't know what he means by oversight. It means it's not the result of thinking. What is more, prayer has the power to generate insight. So that's interesting. So you pray because you have insight, you're aware of God's presence, and it's kind of reciprocal. Praying has the power to generate insight, meaning generate awareness of God's presence. It often endows us with an understanding not attainable by speculation. Speculation here means thinking. Okay? Davening helps you generate an awareness of God with an understanding that you can't get by just thinking. Some of our deepest insights, decisions, and attitudes are born in moments of prayer. I think fundamentalist Christians really get this. They say, I'm going to pray on that. And what they mean, I think, I'm not a fundamentalist Christian. I've never asked one what they mean by that. But I think what they mean by that is, I am going to pray, and I am hoping and expecting that out of that act of praying, I will arrive at some deeper insight, decision, or attitude. I feel you need to forgive that person, or I feel you need to do this, I'm going to pray on that. Okay? It means something different than I'm going to think that through. Okay, pause. Michael has a hand.
Yes. I was wondering whether there's any way to tell from his writing whether when he talks about praying, he means in a minyan.
He does talk about that elsewhere, and I am certain, I can't cite a place for you, I am fairly certain that he would say to you both. Meaning, as an observant Jew, he is in favor of praying in a minyan, and he does talk about elsewhere about stuff about the power of community. Okay, but he wouldn't say, "Oh, you don't." There's only a role for communal prayer, not individual prayer. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I'm speaking for the late Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. I believe he would say both, and of course, most of the time, at least in this class, when we talk about prayer, we're talking about insights from the Siddur, but please remember those sessions we had on the Hasidic idea of hitbodedut, or alonification, being alone with God. We had Rabbi Nachman's view of it, which is you go out into the forest and you talk to God and aloud. I'll come back to something amusing about that in a second. Or was it the Ishbitzer? It wasn't the Ishbitzer. Who was it?
A Tevye moment.
No, the other guy whose name I can't think of right now. Colonimus Kalman of having a senior moment. Sorry, who said not go out into the forest, but take moments of your day. You're struck by an emotion, a feeling about something. Here's where he would disagree with Heschel. Take that feeling and use it as a vehicle to pray to God. Okay? He also had his breathing technique. How come I can't think of his name? Can anyone help me out here? It's not the Slonimer and it's not the Ishbitzer. It's the Piasetzner. Thank you, the Piasetzner. Right? So remember, we read those two different Hasidic ideas months ago about hitbodedut, how to be alone with God, alone with your prayers and God. The amusing thing I want to say, so Rabbi Nachman was Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, and his followers are called the Bratslavers. Okay? And I was in a class, a webinar with an Israeli teacher, and last week she said, you'll be hiking in Israel, you'll be in the forest somewhere, and all of a sudden you'll hear shouting of Oi Tate or Oi Ribono Shel Olam, and you'll know there's a Bratslaver somewhere out here, right? Because their technique is you go out into the forest and you shout, you scream to God. It would not be harder to pull off in America, or you'd really have to go into some deep forest. You couldn't do it on a hiking trail in the Santa Monica Mountains, be shouting like that. Okay, so reciprocal. Back to this. No more jesting. This is serious business. Okay, so insight, awareness of God's presence helps, let's call it, trigger prayer or stands behind prayer. And prayer also generates insight. Okay, by the way, I don't know. I don't have a lot of people on camera, but I'd say raise your hand. I would certainly raise my hand. If you've ever had an insight or a feeling or a thought during prayer, during davening, that you didn't have before. I certainly do from time to time, not necessarily every day. When I'm davening with kavanah, okay, and there's something rattling around in my brain, there's something that emerges, all kinds of thoughts and feelings and insights over the years. Okay, last paragraph on page 211. Know before whom you stand. Such knowledge, such understanding is not easily won. It is, I don't know what he's quoting here. He puts it in quotes. It is neither a gift we receive undeservedly, meaning you don't just get it poof from God or from somewhere else, nor a treasure to be found inadvertently. It's not something you stumble across. So you don't just get it magically. You don't just happen to stumble across it. So how do you get it? The art of awareness of God, the art of sensing God's presence in our daily lives, cannot be learned offhand. Another quote, I don't know where it's from. God's grace resounds in our lives like a staccato. Only by retaining the seemingly disconnected notes comes the ability to grasp. Okay, we read one of his music analogies the other week about the pianist who's paid to do the solo, but they lose themselves in the solo. His one definition of kavanah. So here he's saying, you can listen to music and all you hear is individual notes, or you can listen to music and you can say, I'm able to put it together. I recognize that there is a musical theme, melody, whatever you want to call it. Okay? And he says, that's what God's presence is like. If we would call it connecting the dots. That's kind of what we say in modern parlance. Okay? So how do you become aware of God? In a second, Michael. You connect the dots. He doesn't explain what that is or how you do that. But it's not like magic. All of a sudden I'll have an insight. It's not that I stumble across it, okay? I actually have to do something to get that awareness. And the doing is, and again, he doesn't exactly explain how to do this. Give me a second. I'm just trying to figure out if we're going to go on. We might stop today. I'm not sure, right? But it is somehow, again, there's no formula he gives you. You might say, what's the formula? How do I do this, Heschel? He doesn't tell you, but he says there's something about you have to start with insight and awareness. Prayer generates more insight and awareness, but it starts with insight and awareness. No. Okay, I want to pause. Michael had a hand.
Yes, just as an aside, in each of the Haredi shuls in which I've davened in Jerusalem, the davening doesn't take place from the shulchan. Rather, there's a small reading table in the front, just to the right of the.
Yes.
And in each case, on that reading table, above the table itself, is a sign in Hebrew which says
Dalif name that made. No, before we said, yeah. And by the way, it's a very common quote in synagogues. If you look at synagogues on, the thing over the ark that everyone looks at, that's probably, I'm trying to think. I mean, I haven't done a poll of synagogues throughout the world, but it's probably the most common quote that you will see. Like not Shema, right? Right? Because it is meant to mean like, okay, we're coming to daven. It can mean a lot of different things, right? One thing it means in this context is don't be on, and Heschel would say this, don't be on autopilot, okay? What's your insight and awareness that you come here with? Because that's what helps generate your kavanah, which I think he would say then leads to more insight and awareness. I'm going to pause. Any other comments or thoughts about that? Oh, yep. Paul.
Is it necessary?
Wait, too close.
Sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, it's okay. We're good.
Is it necessary to have the consciousness coming out? Because quite a few of us, especially in the olden days, were brought up with an awareness. It was kind of always there. We never thought about it. Just took it for granted.
Right. Wait, so then ask the first part of your question again. Is it necessary?
Is it necessary to consciously go through the connecting the dots and all that stuff?
Well, I'm going to answer on behalf of Heschel Zal. I think he would say, well, that's preferable, and you'll have better kavanah if you do. But if you said to him, I just came off the street, I just decided to start going to shul, I never thought about God, I'm not a regular davener, I don't think Heschel would say, oh, well then don't come to Minyan, please, before you develop some insight. Okay, I don't think Heschel would say that. I think he would say, come to Minyan, open the Siddur. So as I guess I'm going to say as a kind of a programmatic kind of thing, if that's the right word, he would say, yeah, open the Siddur, learn how to daven. I don't think he would say, don't daven if you've never thought about any of it. I doubt that. You have to take the course first in God awareness before you're allowed to come to Minyan, right? He would say it would be preferable for you to contemplate before whom you stand. And he doesn't mean contemplate in the intellectual sense, right? That's why he's saying it's, awareness or insight. He's goes to lengths to say it's not intellectual, by which I think he doesn't mean don't think about it. I think what he means by that is you don't get it from a book. I think that's what he means. Okay. But, he lived in America. He lived in the contemporary world, and I'm sure he would have said, come to shul, and I hope you figure it out. I understand you're not coming from a place of kavanah, or in let's put it in terms of like, for a lot of people at our morning minyan, right? Tachlis. I understand that you're coming to say Kaddish, to honor the memory of your departed loved one, and that you've never taken a class in the theology, you've never read the weekday morning prayers, and you come here and you don't exactly know what's going on. That's okay. I think Heschel would say, that's okay. And I hope you figure it out. And I hope you develop insight and awareness along the way. I think that's what he would say. Does that answer your question, Paul?
Sort of. But
sort of. Only
my,
sort of.
my,
But only sort of, huh? Go ahead.
Only sort of, because my question was, can you have it instinctively, like if you were given it growing up from your parents as an example, even if they were not shul goers?
Yes, absolutely. Oh yes, absolutely. Just think of all those Hasidic stories of, the shepherd, or, he blew his whistle, or, the shepherd who said, Master of the universe, I tend everyone else's sheep for money, but let it be known before you that if you had sheep and you gave them to me, I would take care of them without any money. And the rabbi rebukes him and says, that's no way to pray, and teaches him the prayer. Don't pray that way, and teaches him the statutory prayers from the Siddur, and goes away. And of course, the shepherd hasn't learned the prayers and doesn't pray at all anymore, because the rabbi rebuked him and said, that's a bad prayer, the one you were saying. But he hasn't replaced it with anything else. And then God comes to the rabbi in a dream and says, that was my favorite prayer, and you ruined it. And he goes back to the shepherd and he says, go say what you were saying before. Okay. It can come from lots of places. It can come from yourself. It can come from you were raised with it. It can come from your parents. So he doesn't say where it might come from, but he says, but it's good to have that awareness before you start. And then the prayer deepens the awareness or the insight. Okay. And I'm sure he wouldn't say, if you don't have any awareness, don't daven. And I'm sure he would say, and awareness comes from lots of different places. He talks a lot. I think we're gonna skip it, but he had a passage about how, we'll get to it. We're not going to get to it this week, but he has this passage about, he re-mentions again and later on in what we're going to read about, wonder and, I'm trying to find the phrase, radical amazement and something or other. Give me a second. Radical amazement. I can't remember. But, right, about blessings, hamotzi, right? He talks about, we say like, oh my God, what an incredible world, right? That there's stuff that germinates and grows from the ground, and that human beings have the ingenuity to have figured out to cut it, grind it, mix it with water, let a fungus float into it from the air, right? Which is what yeast is. And it gets put in the heat, and then we say, oh my God, that is so delicious, and it nourishes us. He says the act of that's just amazing, right? We should have radical amazement. That's one of Heschel's phrases. Why did I start saying this? Right? So Paul, the insight can come from anywhere. It can come from eating a piece of bread, right? Without knowing anything about brachot. And by the way, this is partly why I think we'll finish with this today, and we'll go on to the next part next week. This is partly why I want to take us back to the origins of Hasidism, of Hasidut. The story that the scholars tell, the historians tell, is the following. In Eastern Europe, Jewish accomplishment and expertise, how you became elite in the Jewish community had come to be seen more and more as deep Talmudic learning, which the common people found impossible and abstruse. And the system became that, you support Torah learning economically. That's how you participate in getting closer to God, because you support the Torah scholars. And they came to be seen as the elite of the community. And Hasidism in the early to mid 1700s was a movement that said, no, you can feel close to God and therefore worship God and serve God, but you can feel close to God without being an adept, without being an intellect, without having the time to devote hours and hours and hours to book study, right? You can feel close to God, as Michael quoted me back earlier, by being tevya, and that's why all those Hasidic stories are about the shepherd's certain prayers, or the simple person reciting the Aleph Bet with fervor, because that's all they know. Okay, and again, this is the academic description of the emergence of Hasidism. It was an anti-elite, I don't want to say anti-intellectual, but a non-intellectual movement. And Kabbalah, I'm just going to remind you about things we talked about. Kabbalah, through the form of the Ari's instructions or kavanot for prayers, had also become extremely abstruse. Before you say this prayer, you're supposed to have in mind certain combinations of letters which have to do with God's name and underlines the substance of the universe. And it's important to do these combinations of letters and have them in mind by way of strengthening God. And no one was actually able to do that. It was a system that became so complex. So whether it was the mystical system, Kabbalah, or which we would call esoteric, or whether it was the exoteric system, which was Talmud study of halakha, they both became so complex and abstruse that very few people could really participate in them. And the academic theory of the emergence of Hasidism is Hasidism was a reaction to all of that and an attempt to say, no, you can go for a walk in the forest and contemplate nature and develop insight into God that way. And they didn't say, don't daven, okay? They said, your own simple individual prayer. They were Orthodox. They were not antinomian, okay? Right? Yeah, you should come to shul, you should learn the davening, and you should develop your own individual capacity. Okay? And by the way, Hasidim in general were very interested in the individual's capacity to serve God. One of the important, I'm going to call it, it's not a ritual, but a ritualized experience for Hasidism was called the Yichud. The Yichud in this context means you having a one-on-one audience with the Rebbe. The Rebbe was a spiritual master of great psychological insight, or you couldn't get to be the Rebbe. You had to be spiritual, thoughtful, learned, and psychologically minded. And in your Yichud, you might have a question for your Rebbe about your employment or your marriage or your children or whatever. And the Rebbe would give you their insight. It was what they had by way of what we would call rabbinic counseling, pastoral counseling. But the point of what I'm trying to say is, but it was always individualized. It wasn't a sermon for everyone, right? So how the individual conducts their life in a godly way was very, very important for Hasidim. This seems like an irony to us now, because you look at a photo of a Hasidic Farbrengen, and everyone is dressed exactly the same, and everyone is doing exactly the same motions, okay? But in fact, Hasidism placed great emphasis on the individual's relationship with God. By the way, that's why some of these thinkers talked about hitbodedut. What they meant by hitbodedut was it's really not enough to just go to have a relationship with God. It's not enough to just go to shul and do the 3 statutory prayers daily. You need to have your own time, place, and words for talking to God. By the way, and again, I want to take you back to Rabbi Nachman, what we read. He said, do it in Yiddish, by which he meant do it in your native language, right? Because he knew that you're not going to be very good at talking to God in Hebrew, unless you happen to be a modern Israeli, okay? Talk to God, right? It's about a relationship and familiarity. Okay. Talk to God in language that you understand. Don't worry. God speaks English also. God speaks Yiddish too. God will understand you. Go off alone and do that. That's what he said. Set times of the day. He said an hour a day to go alone into an alone place, which in Central and Eastern Europe would have been the woods. Okay. He doesn't say hiking on the high Sierras. He says into the woods because they had woods. The Piazetzner, who we read about, Heat Bodedut, says not just take time of the day, but here's a method to do it. He had a couple of methods. Remember, we read about his, if you weren't there, then go back and find those. It's all archived on the TBA website, I think with titles, I hope with titles. But he talked about, using breathing techniques and saying certain verses from Psalm. He gave two techniques. One of them was that. One of it had to do with whenever you have an emotion, stop whatever you're doing, explore that emotion, talk to God, say a verse from Psalms that relates to that emotion, and then say, I think it was a 4-step thing, and then say, thank you, God, for being present with me, something like that. So go back and listen to those. So, but they had techniques for how you do your individual relationship with God. And this was really, really crucial. I think I was answering a question, but I don't remember what the question was. Maybe I wasn't answering the question. Okay? But the theory of Hasidism was that you can do it. It's sort of my answer to Paul. Yeah, insight comes from all kinds of places. I want to comment on one more thing about what Paul is saying. There is an essay called Memory and Rupture or something like that by Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, not the Soloveitchik we always mean. It's Yosef Soloveitchik. Rupture and Reconstruction, I can't remember. Anyway, in which he talks about Judaism was always, he uses the word mimetic, which means, how do I put on tefillin? The way my father put on tefillin. Okay? How do you keep a kosher? I'm being sexist, so now, sorry. How do I keep a kosher home? The way my mother kept a kosher home. Okay? And that somewhere along the line in the last few decades, this gave way to, I can't remember what he calls it, but essentially book Judaism. Look in some version of Art Scroll. I don't want to knock Art Scroll or any of the other about how to keep a kosher home. And he says that we've lost something in doing this, in that Judaism always was, we grew up among elders, they did certain things. How do you know when to stand? You come to shul. How do you know when to stand and when to sit? If you don't know, you stand when everyone else does. You sit when everyone else does. How do you know when to put your feet together? You watch when everyone else puts their feet together. How do you kiss your tzitzis? You listen very carefully and watch what other people do. If you're not sure, then ask. If you have a parent who raised you that way, then they talk to you about it. Okay. I'll close with this. There was a rabbi that I heard speaking recently. I think it was Dov Linzer, but I'm not sure, who talked about this, and he said, Orthodox, he and his wife and their kids, they were in Maine for Pesach. There's an obscure reason, I can't remember. He was serving as rabbi, and they ran out of butter, and he just couldn't. He was at 30-ish, early 30s, and he just couldn't remember about does butter need rabbinic supervision. I don't remember if the story was Erev Pesach or during Pesach. I really just don't remember. Okay, I don't remember the details of the story. And he says, what did he do? He did not look on Wikipedia. What do you think he did? See if anyone knows the punchline. He called his mother and he said, Mommy, do I need hashgacha on the butter or not? That's how you know the answer. Now, the problem, of course, by the way, this gets discussed in rabbinical school, and I know it's a joke in rabbinical school, in non-Orthodox rabbinical school, to say, oh, you put on tefillin the way your father put on tefillin, because the rabbinical school is people whose fathers didn't put on tefillin. So in an era in which people are leaving and coming back. It's a constant flow of people in and out of the observance door. It's much harder to live mimetically because many of us didn't grow up seeing it or hearing it. And then it becomes a different question. Certainly if you're a Jew by choice, it's a different question. Okay? And this is why it's important for people to locate themselves then in a community. How do I do things? I do things the way my community does things. Okay. Sorry for yammering. Yammering on, not about our topic. We will continue with Heschel next week. Everyone have a blessed and healthy day. Welcome back to school. God willing, we'll meet again next week.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.